This video is brought to you by the Corsair Virtuoso RGB wireless headset. Compatible with anything you play Final Fantasy XIV on, you can take your gaming and IRL glamour game to the next level with the beautiful new Pearl design. For uncompromised sound quality, visit Corsair.com today and use code MISTECH for 10% off. Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for Eden's Promise Eternity Savage Part 2. This video will focus on the second boss encounter available after the checkpoint. If you're looking for Eden's Promise, check out Part 1. My name is MizTech and I'll be your raid guide. We begin by pulling the boss close to the edge of the platform. This will help us with positioning for the incoming mechanics. Hell's Judgment will bring all player HP levels to single digits. Healers will need to top everyone off as quickly as possible before the next cast Shockwave Pulsar, which will deal high raid-wide damage. Next up, the boss will cast Spell in Waiting, and gain a buff that will cause her next spell cast to be delayed for a short time. Immediately after, she'll cast either Dark Eruption or Dark Water 3. Dark Eruption will target all players with AoE circle blasts that must be spread to avoid overlap. Dark Water 3 will target both healers with a stack-up marker that must be shared among the group. The boss will then cast another Spell in Waiting, followed by another Dark Eruption or Dark Water 3, whichever of the two she didn't originally cast. Both of these mechanics are delayed, but the timing works out that the first attack will go off as the second attack is applying to players. All players should position themselves to handle the first attack before adjusting for the second one. You can keep an eye out on your debuff timer to predict when each attack goes off. Next up, the boss will cast Darkest Dance and leap onto the furthest player for high damage. We have our primary tank bait this with cooldowns while the rest of the raid stays in her hitbox to ensure they don't accidentally bait the boss instead. After the boss jumps, she'll cast a knockback. With our positioning in the hitbox here, all players should be safe from getting knocked off the platform. Immediately after, the second Spell in Waiting mechanic will resolve, and players will need to either spread to assigned positions or remain stacked to survive. Another Shockwave Pulsar, and the boss can be pulled into the center of the room. At this point, she will cast Basic Relativity. This will do massive raid-wide damage and should be mitigated and healed through appropriately. This cast will also place a Spell in Waiting return debuff on all players that lasts about 22 seconds. At the end of its duration, the position and facing of each player will be recorded on the platform. Each player will also be afflicted with another debuff based on their role. Tanks and healers can be subject to Dark Water 3, a shared damage stack which lasts about 35 seconds, or Shadow Eye, a gaze attack which lasts about 22 seconds. Two random damage dealers will get Dark Blizzard 3, a donut attack around the player that lasts either 29 seconds or 16 seconds, while the other two damage dealers will get Dark Fire 3, a targeted circle attack that again lasts either 29 seconds or 16 seconds. The timing of the two damage dealers groups works out that if one of them has the long debuff, the other one will have the short debuff, and vice versa. At the same time, 7 hourglasses will spawn around the platform, 6 red and 1 yellow. The boss will cast Speed and tether 4 red towers with yellow or purple tethers, which will cause them to cast their attacks faster or slower. The yellow tethers will always target the towers directly east and west, while the purple tethers will target either the northeast and northwest towers or the southeast and southwest towers. These towers will target the closest player at the end of their cast with a long laser attack and debuff them with Twice Come Ruin, meaning they can only take 1 tower blast in this mini phase or they will get Doom and eventually die. Since the boss messed with the speed of their casts, players can expect the towers linked with the yellow tethers to attack first, followed by the set of untethered towers, followed by the towers linked with purple tethers. As such, we need a rotation of players to bait each tower blast away from others. We do this based on the debuffs that every player received at the beginning of Basic Relativity. As soon as the cast goes off and the towers appear, all players can reposition around the boss towards the yellow tower and use its location as relative north. As they're doing this, they're identifying the order of the tower explosions. In our group, we have the 2 damage dealers with Blizzard bait the first set of towers directly east and west. If they have the fast Blizzard timer, this will safely explode around them out of the way of the rest of the group. If they have the slow Blizzard timer, they'll simply run back into the group stack. If the fire players have the faster debuff, they'll use this time to spread behind the group at the edge to take their attacks. If they have the slower debuff, they will simply wait with the group at yellow. The second towers will be baited by the healers. To accomplish this, they simply move to the right and left of the group stack. If they have the gaze attack, this positioning allows players to automatically avoid it since they'll be facing the boss. Around this time, the record debuff of all players will reach the end of its duration, and all player positions will be recorded on the platform. Before this occurs, the two tanks will move closer to the yellow tower to ensure that they are in between the group and the yellow tower. If the tanks have gaze, this movement also allows for an automatic gaze dodge since all players will be targeting the boss. The two tanks will then run to bait the last set of towers, which will be either in the southeast-southwest or northeast-northwest. At this same time, the yellow tower will begin to cast a massive point-blank AoE. The raid can move into the direct center of the platform to avoid this point-blank attack. Around this time, the slow blizzard or slow fire debuffs will also be resolving. If it's slow blizzard, all players except the baiting tower tanks can stay stacked in the middle to avoid the donut attack. If it's slow fire, these two players will spread away from the group and tanks to take their fire attacks alone. As these final attacks resolve, all players will be stunned and then return to their recorded positions. At this point, the yellow tower will cast Empty Hate, a massive knockback that deals proximity-based damage. This proximity damage is the reason the tanks record their position closer to the yellow tower than the rest of the group. Finally, Dark Water is the last debuff to go off, and the groups must split into two to share the damage as they return to the boss. Healers be ready to top everyone off before the next Shockwave Pulsar. Next up, the boss will cast Singular Apocalypse and the platform will slightly change. A very tiny ray of light will then begin to move around the platform, signaling the direction in which a sequence of circle attacks will soon target the platform. She will then turn to face a random cardinal and begin to cast Cataclysm. All players will need to identify the direction she's looking in and move to the edge opposite to avoid the next attack. The boss will leap in that direction, dealing a massive point-blank AoE when she lands. The ray of light that was traveling around the room will soon reach the end of its path here, and the actual attacks will begin, starting in the center and then traveling around the outer edge of the platform in the direction shown by that ray of light. Players will need to position themselves out of the path of this attack to avoid high damage and debuffs. At the same time, the boss will cast Black Halo, a massive frontal cone tank buster. There are only two of these the entire fight, so I would highly recommend using an immunity. As soon as the first light attack targets the center of the platform and begins to rotate around the edge, all players can stack up in the center. The boss will be casting Shell Crusher at this time, which will deal massive damage on a random person that needs to be soaked by everyone to survive. Immediately after, she'll cast Spirit Taker, which will again target a random person, but must be taken alone or all players it hits will die. To handle this, simply spread to assigned positions to avoid overlap. Be super careful not to spread into the path of the incoming light attack. The boss will then cast another Shockwave Pulsar and the platform will return to normal. The main tank can now drag the boss back into the middle to prepare for intermediate relativity. Again, this cast will deal massive raid-wide damage and all players should have their mitigation shields and heals ready to survive the blast. This time, all players will be marked up with Spell in Waiting Return 4, which works in the same manner as before but will record the player's position multiple times. They will also each receive another 3 debuffs based on their role, one of which will last 31 seconds, the second will last 27 seconds, and the third will last 23 seconds. All players will get Dark Eruption, the targeted circle attack that must be spread apart. All tanks and healers or all damage dealers will be targeted by Dark Blizzard 3, the donut attack, or Dark Arrow 3, the large targeted circles that will knock back anyone hit, whichever of the two the other role group does not have. The players that got Dark Arrow 3 will also always have Shadow Eye, the gaze attack. Of the players that receive Dark Blizzard 3, 3 of them will always have Flare, the usual proximity-based damage attack, and one of them will get Dark Water 3, the stack-up damage. Obviously, this is an insane amount of information to process all at once, but luckily there is a pattern to this madness. All of the Dark Eruption timers are the same. Arrow and Blizzard timers, and Shadow Eye, Flare, and Dark Water timers will all always occur together. Since these specific attacks are grouped together, we can easily work out assigned positions to take these attacks at the same time. Each player will have an assigned position around the boss for their Dark Eruptions. Arrow and Flare markers will always be taken to the edges in the same clock positions, while Blizzard will always be taken directly in the center of the platform. The Shadow Eye and Dark Water attacks will be taken in the inner circle of the platform, with all affected players in their assigned clock positions looking outwards. This satisfies the requirement of stacking for Dark Water, while also avoiding gaze regardless of who inside the inner circle has it. Now the last thing to add is the Record 4 debuff effect. As soon as the intermediate relativity cast goes off, players will need to identify which debuff is the longest, the second longest, and the shortest. The easiest way to do this is to look at your debuffs from right to left, ignoring the return debuff. This debuff order will show each player how they need to position for each round of mechanics, and they'll use the Return 4 countdown to do so. The longest debuff will be the first one recorded, and players should be in their position within the first 12 seconds of Return 4. Once this position is recorded, Return 4 will switch to a 5-second duration, and players will immediately need to run to their assigned position to record where they will take their second longest debuff. Once that position is recorded, they will then run to the appropriate position to handle their shortest debuff. As they're running to handle this short debuff, all players must also look out from the center of the platform to avoid the incoming gaze attacks. As the short debuff is about to naturally resolve, all players will be stunned and return to their 2 recorded positions, all while each attack resolves around them. As long as each player has properly positioned themselves for each round of debuffs, they can sit back and enjoy the light show. Eventually, players will be able to move again, and the encounter continues with another shockwave pulsar to heal through. Next up, Dual Apocalypse. This is similar to the first Apocalypse, except this time 2 rays of light will spawn from the center and begin to travel around the outer edge of the platform in opposite direction, indicating the direction of the eventual 2 light circle attacks that will move around the platform. Another Cataclysm cast will have her facing towards a random cardinal and jumping in that direction. The group will move opposite this area to avoid the attack. The circle light attacks will begin in the center again, and all players should wait for this initial explosion before moving in. The boss will then cast Somber Dance, and first leap to the furthest player from her before immediately leaping onto the closest player. We have the primary tank bait this first jump with cooldowns away from the group in between the light circle attacks on the outer edge, and the secondary tank bait the second jump by having them follow the boss in. This can be very tricky to do on the outer edge, as you'll need to appropriately dodge the light circle attacks as well, so be careful. At this point, the platform will return to normal and the boss will cast another Shell Crusher. The group will stack up to share this damage. This is again followed by Spirit Taker, and the group will need to immediately spread to avoid death. Heal through the damage and get ready for another Shockwave Pulsar Raid Blast. Next, the boss will cast Advanced Relativity, and you'll need to mitigate and heal through this damage as necessary. Again, this is another debuff vomit combo that players will have to break down, but this time with towers. Since we're already well versed in what each debuff does and how Return 4 will record our positions, it's just a matter of locating the safe spots for each round based on what debuffs you have. Once Advanced Relativity begins to cast, we have the group ready to split in their assigned light parties. The Hourglass towers will always spawn with 3 in the south and 3 in the north, so we assign each group to north or south. As soon as the boss begins to cast speed, players will be able to identify the yellow tethered tower and move behind it as their starting point. This triangle area directly behind the yellow tethered tower will be used to help players find their assigned spots for each record. We'll also be using the lines on the platform that look like flower petals to aid positioning that avoids each tower attack. Each group will stack up in this relative position behind their yellow Hourglass tower and wait to record their first placement, while taking the first hit of Dark Water. The player afflicted with 2 arrow debuffs will be positioned slightly ahead of the group, as they will eventually serve as a controlled knockback for the other players. As soon as the first position is recorded, the player of each group that has gaze will run to the right side of the triangle right against the edge and record their second position there. All other players will run to the left side of the triangle and record their second positions there. For the final round, the gaze player on the right will move to the other side of the flower petal pattern on the platform. Over on the left side, the player that started with the double arrow debuff will mirror this movement and record their next placement on the other side of their flower petal. The remaining players with Dark Fire will continue to rotate towards the left to drop off their attacks directly east or west. One player will be on the edge, while the other will be closer to the middle. To avoid confusion, we assign these positions beforehand. As this final positioning is happening, all players must ensure that they are also facing outwards to avoid the eventual gaze attack. At this point, players will be stunned, and as long as everyone recorded their positions appropriately based on their debuffs, they'll end up back in safe light groups to share the final Dark Water splash. Once everything resolves, the boss will become targetable again, and she'll cast another Shockwave Pulsar. Next, she'll cast Triple Apocalypse, and this time, 3 rays of light will form and begin to move around the platform. One light will begin in the center and move outwards, while the other 2 lights begin at the edges. The group will need to follow the light out of the center and identify where it turns and intersects with one of the incoming edge lights. This spot is safe for the group to stand in while they wait for the center to explode. During this time, the boss will cast Darkest Dance and leap to the furthest player from her. Again, we have our primary tank bait this with cooldowns on the edge while the group gets ready to position themselves for the Darkest Dance knockback. All players will have to quickly position themselves behind the boss to get knocked backwards in between the moving light circles on the outer edges. At this point, the platform will return to normal and the boss will cast another Shockwave Pulsar. This is immediately followed by another Black Halo Frontal Cleave Tank Buster. Don't forget those cooldowns. Finally, the boss will cast Terminal Relativity. This initial cast does some pretty high damage, so be ready to mitigate. But don't go too crazy, as this cast essentially begins her soft enrage, and you'll need as much mitigation and healing as possible. Each player will be afflicted with 3 Quietest debuffs of different durations. As these debuffs expire, they'll do massive raid-wide damage. The boss will also cast 3 Shockwave Pulsars in a row. As you can imagine, multiple Quietest debuffs going off in succession into Shockwave Pulsars followed by even more Quietest explosions calls for some heavy healing. I would highly recommend setting up a raid cooldown rotation for each Pulsar to ensure survival. After the 3 Pulsar hits and everyone's quietest debuffs going off, the boss will cast her final enrage, Memory's End. You'll need to destroy her before this cast goes off, or you will die. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. I'll see you all back again in 5.5. As always, thanks for watching. Till next time.